Good afternoon. Before I ever was going to be here for the talk, I was envisioning myself throwing this mask as though it was like a graduation. But in this event, I'll just please ask you to excuse me, and that I'll be taking it off and to offer this talk to you. So, according to tradition, this is often a time that we'd acknowledge Buddha Shakyamuni and the ancestors. And I know early on I kind of felt this element of, okay, it's part of this process. You do these things. But I can say over the years, it just feels natural. It's a part of the living practice. And you can't help but feel the ancestors, starting with Buddha Shakyamuni, here with us at this time. So, with deep gratitude to all those who have carried on this tradition, this practice, so that we can be here to really awaken. I can't imagine my life without it, and all the people who have facilitated throughout the years to both be in the practice and to support me in it. And just that community has been, at least for myself, probably the most powerful impact of this practice, the Sangha. I really see it as the living embodiment of this Buddha Dharma. And without the Sangha, what would we be doing? So, I'd like to thank Shinge Roshi, our beloved teacher, someone who I had the immense fortune of encountering 15 years ago. And since that time, it's been an instrumental and just vital part of my life, a bond which I can't really describe. And it's just the beauty of so much of it is just unspoken. And one of the things that I really appreciated early on in my time of practicing at Hoenji, I started there, as I mentioned, 15 years ago. There was a deep presence class. I'll revisit some of that later, but around that time, sometime within the first few years, I remember Roshi saying that her practice was about being raw. And it left really a mark on me. There was just something about that has stayed with me since that time, and something that I really feel at this time. A vulnerability of which I, in many ways, always wanted, but not necessarily with some of the effects that come out of that. But I find great inspiration in really, through that process of really being able to be open and available and to meet people where they are. I've just found, a tremendous gift in that. I just find that in many ways, like dynamics between my exchanges with people have just subtly shifted. Certainly as also with myself. There's that element in having to be vulnerable with myself in order to be vulnerable with others. So it's been a real gift for me. And I also like to thank my parents, my sister, and family. They definitely don't necessarily understand what I'm doing, but have always been in full support. There's times you can tell there's a curiosity of which I haven't quite figured out how to offer in a way in which that feels more accessible. All I can think of in some ways, my mother was a teacher, and it was something clearly for her. She's very deeply connected with that. It was definitely a calling for her. And I think that's about all I can equate it to. There's this element in which that you have to answer that call. And so I've been continuing on in the practice and have had their support and feel very fortunate knowing that not everybody has that. And the residents of DBZ, I've been coming here for some years. And I guess in terms of residents, really starting back in 2011. For those that have been around, there was certainly a lot of tumult through that time period and the years thereafter, but the people who were around and the people that I got to really delve into this practice with here and really get to start to experience the depth of the training, the profundity of having my whole notions turned upside down and wrung out and torn apart. And just really their willingness to support the Sangha, this community, through that whole process was really inspiring in many ways. It's something that their impact and influence on me is, I can't really measure it. There's still people that I love and in many ways miss. And then of course we have our current residents, people who I've gotten to know in some ways very intimately. As I was saying, just this way in which my experience of meeting with people, engaging with them, has definitely changed, and they've really been instrumental in that process. Just their own willingness to be vulnerable. Talk about things that are very painful. And knowing for myself, like, that can be a very, very difficult process. I guess I'll kind of lead into that in a little bit, but I can say in my own path, like, just being able to simply speak of what I was going through was something that I felt really imprisoned by. And then in the spirit of Soen Roshi, who I have a very deep affinity with, this universal Sangha relation, all the known and unknown, sentient and insentient beings. I'm sure for each of you, you have so many people in your lives that have facilitated you being here. And then all the people that you didn't know, just all the other things, the flowers, the rocks, the trees, this great earth, and beyond the realm of just this universe. And I found in the process of reflecting on when I was asked to do this talk that really the recitation that we did this morning, Faith in Mind, so this Sosan Kanchi Zenji, our third ancestor in China, has impacted me in ways that I haven't really grasped, and I definitely don't really now, but it just continues to be ever revealing in this process. A profound gratitude for Sosan Kanchi Zenji, of the Faith in Mind recitation, that each time we recite it, something else just seems to turn. In some ways, just something is just a little light dusting. There's something that comes forth that I hadn't seen previously, some detail. And in that detail, it opens up to something far beyond what I can conceive. So, in looking at Sosan Kanchi Zenji's Faith in Mind, I feel that my challenge today is best summed up by the following passage. Wordiness and intellection, the more with them, the further astray we go. Away, therefore, with wordiness and intellection, and there is no place we cannot pass freely. When we return to the root, we gain the meaning. When we pursue external objects, we lose the essence. The moment we are enlightened within, we go beyond the voidness of a world confronting us. So I'll start by, giving a little introduction to myself. Really, in many ways, I know you all. Some I'm just meeting more recently. But I'm sure that by virtue of being here in this practice, many of you encounter this. It certainly comes up with some frequency that we sit together, we share all this time, there's a deep intimacy, and then we part ways. And there's people that you have this really amazing connection with that you have never shared a word with. You don't even know their name. And it's an amazing gift. And yet I have found there is a certain power in just having some of those narratives. They don't necessarily give you an insight exactly into how that person is, but it can be revealing, if nothing else, even in terms of your own life and some of the things that you relate and connect with, ways that you don't necessarily know that you share certain connections, even connections with other people. So I'll just go a little bit into my own path of how I came to the practice. I was born in the Milwaukee area out in Wisconsin, Midwestern boy. And in many ways had kind of a typical upbringing. My parents' sister, and grew up with a dog who I mostly, want to talk about because, she was just such a wonderful dog. She was a German Shepherd that had in many ways a really big impact on my life as well. So when I was little, my sister, she's actually younger than me, so a couple of years. So when we were little in particular, I really looked after her. I just wanted to make sure she was always safe. And in some ways, the element of why that was important was best summed up by our father, which he indicated that really the difference between us is if there's a cliff, my sister would be the one that you run, you jump over it, and you find out what's on the other side as you're in the air. And I would be the one that would go up to the edge and assess before I would make any determination of what to do. So she had a little bit more of that rambunctiousness, a kind of free-spirited element. So I just made sure to look after her and helped her get through some of those times. And yeah, I'm really grateful just for her presence in my life. And one of the wonderful things within the context of my family is just knowing that I was always loved. I never had any question of that. We've, of course, had our own family problems, things that would come up, and yet there was never any way in which I felt that was in question or jeopardized. And it was, as I said, was something that still comes through in the fact of just them unconditionally supporting me in continuing and being in this practice. And then, I guess mostly partly because I was indicated that Sonia, the German Shepherd I grew up with, she was a 100-pound female shepherd. And yeah, she was very loyal, as all German Shepherds are, and really, really looked out for my sister and I. And I just have some memories of when I was little, and partly there's some pictures of things where I'd basically use her as a chair. So, whether it be like having a snack or like the TV, I could just sit down on her, and she was quite tolerable of that. But then one of the things that really struck me and continues to come to mind over the years was some point, for whatever reason, she loved rocks. She generally liked to chase things, to retrieve things, but she loved rocks. And there was some point where we were on a trail, and so we were throwing some rocks, my sister and I, and there was one that I picked up, and I just put my hand back. And so tenderly, delicately, she put her mouth over my hand. And in that simple act was just that love. Yes, she was expressing an element of she really wanted that rock. But there was just such a love and care in just that simple act of expressing her interest. So I don't know how much people, for some of you I've known for a while, so you have a little better sense of these things. I don't know what perception people necessarily have me otherwise. Definitely in my childhood, I was really shy, very timid, very quiet, but also observant and very sensitive. That was certainly something you don't think much of as a kid, but as you get older, that becomes more apparent that you don't necessarily fit the mold. So in many ways, I'm still sensitive, as perhaps evidenced by my face, but that's just kind of a little element of my childhood. And I've always been, in some ways, just much like my parents and my mother in particular, pretty self-driven. So even as a little kid, I would do things like I wanted to learn to tie my shoes. So I went through that whole process, and basically I could get shoes that I could tie if I went through that. So I taught myself, basically after my parents gave me some instruction, how to tie my shoes. There was some point in preschool where we were asked to share a story to bring in a book. So I went home and I told my mother that I had to learn how to read. So there was the book, There's a Nightmare in My Closet. And over the course of that evening, went through the whole process of learning how to read it, so that I again could share with the class. I think somewhere there might be some old cassette tape that my mother felt inclined to record. I think fortunately it's lost, hopefully forever, but somewhere out there might still be that tape. I also remember at the point I was probably 6 or 7, teaching myself how to ride a bike. There was like a sort of a training bike without training wheels at like a kinder care, one of those child care facilities in the area. And I would just go out there. Each day we'd be outside, and I would just keep trying to ride it, until I found my balance. And then through also the fortune of my parents teaching me that, the value of $1, I had to learn, well, basically earn my own first bike. So I went through that whole process of earning things from chores and selling some other things in some garage sale, to the point that I could then buy my own bike. And then I remember the first time having done all this practice, and there's still that hesitancy. So I went on the bike, I didn't have the training wheels, and I rode right into the raspberry bushes that were alongside the driveway. And even then I was like, oh, come on, like, you can do this. So I jumped back on the bike and then rode off. And in some ways it just feels, kind of appropriate to just the elements of life. I would say that there's not times that I feel that I just jump back on, but at the same time, don't necessarily give up. And I think I'll just revisit that a little bit later as well. So that's a little bit just of my early childhood. And then really there's that period of adolescence. I'm sure many of us would rather not recall that time period. I had a very common experience, as I assume you did, of confusion, anger, insecurity, things that I think are almost universal. And yeah, it was a challenging time though. I know that I always had high expectations of myself. It's definitely been one of those things that has really both pushed me and held me back in many ways. And I had that from an early age, and certainly through my adolescence was no exception. So at that time for myself was particularly challenging and kind of an early bloomer. So basically having all those hormones raging through my body and not having the skills to really deal with them. And I think really a lot of things I haven't fully grasped, and yet there's this just general sense that through that time period that a lot of things that I kind of condemn myself for were from that time period. It was really definitely very challenging. Like fifth grade, I would literally have a headache every day. And it was only sometime in the last few years that it dawned on me that that was probably just from all the testosterone, like all the hormones going through my body. And it's so much so that at some point I literally just gave up taking any medication for it, because I knew no matter what I did, I'd have a headache. It was a challenging time. And unfortunately, as I indicated, that there was kind of through that difficulty in transitioning, a lot of things that I just kind of let go of. So I was pretty self-driven. I had lots of things. I was really into nature. So I even started to make collections of like seeds and like pressed leaves, all sorts of things. I knew a fair amount about like plants outside, and all these things were things that I just kind of put behind me. In many ways didn't really pick them up. I went on to school in ecology and such, but at the same time there was kind of that way in which something was just kind of not taken away, but misplaced. And then just to make things even more interesting was the point of then reaching like 12, and suddenly like the hormones balanced. So you go through this period, you don't really feel yourself, there's so much confusion, and almost like it just stopped. And at this point I can appreciate the fact of like, okay, well, there was those difficulties, those hardships, but they don't define me. But certainly at that time, there was just so much of that uncertainty and all that judgment really of the time that I'm, particularly like 5th and 6th grade. I think particularly in that seemingly sudden and largely contrasting condition, I just didn't really know how to move forward or how to embrace the fact of, all right, like, yes, those things happen, but now I have a new opportunity. And so I didn't really find that, unfortunately. It took really many years until like that was possible. Ultimately, like ended up really starting through that process though of this real investigation into what pain is. We have the Four Noble Truths and like what is suffering. Well, I can say that I assume anyway, for many of you, that was what led you to the practice. I can definitely say that in my own time leading up to the practice, it was a deep investigation of samsara. And in some of that early exploration, I found myself in an English project. We were called upon to do a theme. And so I did one on pain. And it was probably the first time that I really vocalized lots of things that I've been going through, but in a way in which they weren't necessarily specific. And a lot of it too was like focusing on senses of loss. I'm somebody, I don't like goodbyes. Even up to this point, I really don't like goodbyes. And at an early age, you just start to find yourself familiarized with this element of impermanence. The people that we love, like pets, that they're not always going to be with us. And in many ways, I really struggled with that. Knowing that those I loved in my own life, just at some point they come to an end. And there is an endless element to it, but in the immediacy of our lives, it's also very real that we know loss, in part because we know love. And there's this real companion between those. And in that deep sense of love, I had difficulty coming to terms with that feeling of loss. So kind of moving on into like the high school years, I ended up becoming really increasingly isolated. As I said, I was having difficulty really examining things. One of the challenges of being in the Midwestern life is there's just things you don't talk about. That was kind of my general upbringing. Some of it kind of the Scandinavian influence. And yeah, otherwise this is the way of like also just being a youth. There's just things that you don't want to talk about because you don't realize that everybody else actually experiences similar things. And so, I just found myself increasingly isolated. Went through a period of like major depression. And a lot of weight loss and continued loss of interest. I kind of reflected on that time. I know in having talked a little bit with people about it before, I sort of thought, well, I wonder if they think this question of like, well, what do your parents do? And I kind of have found myself thinking of like, I know that they were there for me. I know that in some ways too, they also like pursued things that they knew would be ways in which I'd be more likely willing to, come out of that box. And even thinking back of at some point where I reconnected with like a childhood friend, and really in retrospect have, I think, a very clear understanding that like my mother had contacted his mother. And ultimately, like there was a way though in which the beauty was that we reconnected. And through that process, like I got to open up with some other people, and started to kind of have a shift. And really then in my senior year was this element of kind of coming out of my shell, and finding out the other challenges of that. So I assume some of you too, there's ways in which you want to connect with your peers, and then there's that beauty of the, well, although false sense of freedom, ways in which you feel uninhibited by things like alcohol, marijuana, things that at least for me became both ways of release, but in some way also ways of investigation. And if nothing else, I'm not saying that it's recommended, but it does shift your perspective on things. Kind of those elements of voices in my head, they drop out. And the challenge being that if you turn to them for that purpose ultimately, there is a way in which you depend on them for that. And they get louder. You haven't been listening, and so they really can get pretty hostile about the matter. And so it's kind of the overall process that I found myself experiencing. And at the same time, there was an increased like curiosity and investigative element in that. So not only having a way in which knowing that things can be different, but also be curious about what's going on. I think it was always in some ways curious and investigative, but at that point in particular, it's really started to be a shift in terms of like my own experience, and just my own views in relationship to the world. So finishing up, I ended up going to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Really, it was one of those decisions that changed the course of my life in ways I hadn't really thought about until recently. Kind of seeing all the different pieces, but seeing of like really that event facilitated so many things thereafter. So I went to school at Madison. I went initially for the tour and just knew when I was there that that's where I wanted to go. I did get accepted. I did attend, ultimately graduated. But for those that are familiar, it's definitely a party school. If you want to find a party every day, you can. And if you're hosting them, you definitely can, especially. So I didn't have any challenge with finding ways to have a release from that. I love having grown up in Wisconsin. There's things that I love about a passionate element of that culture. And part of that comes with its pros and cons of like this notion in which like you work hard and you play hard. And there's ways in which that can be taken to extreme measures, as I decided that I would also engage with, and had various people that were willing to do that with me. And it's an interesting thing though. I mean, some of it is like, I know that there's, we talk about true friends on the way. And yet at the same time, like even in those conditions, like there are people that I have a really deep connection to even to this day. Some of it is like going through those times together. But at the same time, even if you don't talk about them, there's a way in which you're working out some of the same things. In that time I was using all sorts of alcohol and smoking a lot of marijuana. And at some point, basically, like as I mentioned, there's ways in which if you're not listening, things get really hostile, and all those things that you're ignoring want to come forth. They don't just go away, as I've found over time, and you do kind of feed them by ignoring them. There's a way in which you can ignore them and that you're not basically accommodating them, but if you're avoiding them, this really is its own energetic way of feeding them. And so ultimately it was like 2 weeks shy of my 20th birthday, I had a nervous breakdown. I was visiting a friend of mine, we were just hanging out, and it was just all of a sudden this way in which I felt like I was having a heart attack. I ended up saying to my friend, like, okay, I think if we could call the ambulance. Did that, went to the hospital, and ultimately, there wasn't anything inherently wrong physically with me, but it was that way of which like things really having to come forth. It was an incredibly difficult time, but there was a way in which through going through that process, strange clarity kind of emerged through all of it. And some of it I found, as you're talking about some of that motivation before, I was getting like pretty socially involved in various things, like, trying to eat healthy, do various things to really change my life. Found that there was a way in which I could understand people's challenges, their difficulties in ways I hadn't really been aware of prior. I think in my intuition, I was aware of various things, but just to have a sense of like the experiential process. So although having that, I actually at that point found my way to a Vipassana practice. There was at some like local Unitarian church. The first time I literally walked over there, I don't know how far it was, I walked a lot those days. Got some exposure. Of course, had no idea what was going on. It wasn't like going to Hoenji the first time and you at least got some sort of instruction. I pretty much walked in, just tried to follow along. And then ultimately talked to the woman who was leading that group, who encouraged me to take a course that she was going to be leading at the local technical college. So it was one of those 6-week courses, much like Deep Presence. And you go in and you start to learn about the practice, the ways in which you can have tools that really allow you to meet, process, and experience your life. And the one thing I found, however, is that I knew I had a lot of anxiety at that time. So you sit down and guess what you find? Pronounced anxiety. So I found that wasn't necessarily the time for me to try to do that. There's ways in which I think the practice itself didn't feel quite right, but it was just also not yet. I wasn't quite ready to really delve in yet. And yeah, and then unfortunately went back into like ways in which like I didn't know how to deal with my experience. So like really basically became like a heavy drinker. And yeah, as I said, like there was friends that like, we definitely partied, but I sort of stood out as somebody of like definitely very self-destructive. And in some ways they sort of joke with me about it. In other ways, I definitely know that was like deep concern. They would certainly, also make sure to kind of see after me at times. And I don't know, a curious thing throughout all of that, is that although highly not recommended, there was a way in which like all that process was like learning about coping mechanisms. And I found over the years of like, there's a way in which like it can be talked about in a negative way. And I understand why. Oftentimes there's this element in which we take them on, but we don't know how to let go of them. They help us get through a time period, but then we don't know how to move on. And so at least I was becoming aware of some of these things and just really trying to take action to like do as I was doing previously after having had a nervous breakdown, like trying to like really, just allow things to change, to find a new way of living my life, to find other methods. And I wasn't necessarily productive in finding other methods, but I sort of found this in that although on appearances people might not seem to be tending to things, it doesn't mean they aren't really engaging with it. And kind of the example I can think of that really highlights this is there was, during that time period, like 2 movies that I kind of watched over and over. There was Pulp Fiction and The Royal Tenenbaums. In some ways they seem like very different movies, but really they're stories of redemption. That's the essence of them. They're about redemption. And that's what I really needed to have a message of at that time. And through that process, even at some point in the movie Pulp Fiction, there's some time where Samuel L. Jackson, they're in the diner and he's talking about, having this, what he says alcoholics refer to as a moment of clarity. And at some point had what I can only say a moment of clarity. If nothing else, as I said, it was like in some ways a deep investigation of samsara. And something opened. And I wasn't ready to really move through it in many ways, but at the same time it was so clear. And it was the first time that I think I was conscious of the fact of being able to have an idea and in some ways to be able to really hold it. You're not containing it. It's just this element of it's in your hands. And you can rotate it, you can look at it, you can get different perspectives about what it really is. And so much so that even years later, I was able to just look further into that. And I ended up writing a poem. I just kind of I'll cut out the first part of it because it's really more of the element of like the context in which I was engaging in all these self-destructive behaviors. But I titled it A Moment of Clarity due to the inspiration of the Pulp Fiction. And there's a part in there in which really it's, I would say, a description of samsara. Despair erodes what hope remains into the silted rivers of my mind, grown thick with emptiness, frustration, and pain wrought through time. Remnants of self-control guide me through this murky flow, seeking release from barrenness in a world of tormented souls. So, although even not at that time, like there was that part of me that really knew what I was in, I just didn't know the way to get through it. And fortunately at that point, at least through having that experience, like did what I could to kind of keep chipping away at kind of trying to tend to those things. And at some point, was finishing up school and was fortunate enough to have a TA for an ecology of fishes class that worked for the Cornell Biological Field Station. He was somebody that was able to connect me basically with a job that led me out east. Previously, I had looked at schools out east, actually even at Syracuse, at Cornell, And yeah, so there was this element in which also not yet. Being called to a certain area, partly my cousin lived in the area, so she could take me around to look at the schools. But yeah, to find my way back, ultimately at the time that was right. And so I ended up with that job, and I knew part of it, why I was interested in it, was one, needing a job, of course, but also the fact that I knew for things to change, I needed to leave where I was. So yeah, it might be surprising. I used to be really, really, really quiet. I remember actually in that time of depression when I was in high school, where I started to get really into Bob Dylan, and there's this song, Watching the River Flow. And the very first line is, "What's the matter with me? I don't have much to say." And I seem to have gotten over that issue. But yeah, it's something that in many ways, I'm grateful for the fact that now at least I'm able and willing to articulate what I'm going through. So I know that the residents here have find times they'll talk with me. As I mentioned, it's been one of the really rewarding experiences of being here, to engage with people in that way, to meet them in their own experience and to share mine. And kind of looking ahead, this way in which the things of my past or even my present experience aren't really mine. They're things that, when called for, are things to offer. You just never know. There's times I'm really surprised at the things that I'll say. I don't think about them. They just kind of come forth. And sometimes they just seem to be, that lid that matches that box and really just suits the occasion. So it's been one of the gifts in part of, as I said, partly being able to come forth and just simply be okay with talking about these things. To know that other people might not have had the same experiences, but there are those that have had quite similar ones. And to simply, if nothing else, offers somebody the fact of they're just not alone. I think that was one of the real lessons of that time period in my life, is that immense sense of isolation. And it really is, it feels rather condemning, especially when you have all those other inner dialogues and narratives about yourself. So in finding the way to open up and finding the ways to really connect with people, I found that there's been a gift to just simply offering a word. So within a short time of ending up in the Syracuse area, north of Syracuse is Oneida Lake, where the Cornell Field Station is. But after I started that position, 2 months later, my grandmother died. And this is somebody who I'll highlight in just a little bit, but is an immense influence on my life. I hope that some of you have had this experience of one of those true bodhisattvas. You know of the importance and just the gift of their presence in your life at that time, but really in her passing it has become more and more and more apparent. Really a guiding light. And in some ways all she had to do was be herself. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it was definitely a challenging loss. And that was really ultimately what got me to finally really decide to go to the Zen Center of Syracuse. I knew that I was interested in at least in meditation, and I had a curiosity about Zen. One of the things about being in college, at least there was a Buddhist studies classes, and I was definitely interested in that. And one of the gifts was my second class that I took was Tibetan Buddhism, but the professor was actually a Buddhist practitioner. So we had actually a very small class. I think it was almost the point they were going to cancel it, but thankfully they didn't, because everybody that was there was genuinely interested in not just that, it wasn't a study, it was an academic to them. And he was able to facilitate really engaging it in a way in which I hadn't been able to look at some of those things before. And then ended up taking another class. Unfortunately, he ended up having to leave the university just because, unfortunately, downsizing really. They brought somebody else in from actually the same technical college where I went to the Vipassana course. And for him, it was academic. And it was really unfortunate. It was a Buddhist thought class. And so one of the projects, though, I was like, okay, I've learned about other sects of Buddhism, but I didn't know about Zen. So I tried to investigate more about it. And I didn't know why, but I was just interested. And it's really beyond my comprehension at this point of like how I couldn't have find materials. I was at a huge school. I mean, books alone. I mean, how many Zen books have come out just, even since the 30s, and particularly since the 50s and 60s. And yet somehow I just didn't encounter any of those materials. And yet here I found myself going to the Zen Center of Syracuse. And at that point, it was right. I wasn't meant to engage with it in an intellectual manner. I was fortunate that the Dharma provided the circumstances I needed, in which depriving me of that way and distorting my understanding by wordiness and intellection. So I was able to go to that class, and a few weeks into it, I was watching the movie Alive. So imagine some of you know that story of the I don't know, soccer, football team, whatever it was, who their plane crashed in the Andes Mountains. And, circumstances in which some people die, like injured, and, having to resort to cannibalism, things like that. But like the thing that really, really, really impacted me was there was this person who throughout the time since the crash had been basically on like a gurney. Like he wasn't able to move, like his leg was broken. And there was some point where he was meeting his death. And he just starts to cry. And his friend asks him, like, what's the matter? And he just says, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And then my Zen practice began. There were all those seeds, all the catalysts leading me to it. But that was the moment where it really started. And in that process, I started to go to Sunday services, to the Thursday evenings. At that point, I was living at the field station, so I had to commute. It was about a half-hour drive each way. So it was something that, it certainly was a factor. I had to kind of look at things in terms of getting out work early, and then going to Hoenji on Sundays. And yeah, I just found my way of really being part of the community. I didn't really see myself as a practitioner at the start. In some ways, I don't actually now. But I just kept being called back. I didn't really have to think about it. I just kept going. And yeah, so much so, I guess I said I was starting that fall, and by the spring, went to my first session, and just kept going and kept going and kept going. And then, being this still fairly timid, shy person, Roshi encouraged me to at least attend Obon at DBZ. I actually remember my first time being here. I remember certain things about Obon and the general experience, but one of the things I do remember is in that shyness, in that kind of wanting to avoid crowds in particular, I camped out in Sangha Meadow. So that was my first introduction to being at DBZ, was being part of the ceremony, but otherwise putting myself in a much more isolated position. And I mean, that's what I needed at the time. But even then, actually, when I think back of meeting Ryoju and Mark, at that time, he introduced himself as John. And it's funny, just those little connections. I didn't really get to know him till later on, when then I returned really for Kesseis. I did have the fortune of doing one session anyway with Edo Roshi. It was Holy Days 2009. It was just one of those times. There's that convergence of not just the different holy holidays at that point, but in that particular week was the full moon. And this real transition between the winter into spring. And just that transformation of that time period, and just the power of the setting and the people, and of Edo Roshi. He had certainly quite a presence. I mostly remember my experiences of going to Dokusan with him as going into the dragon's lair. I'd open the door, I'd walk in, and the first thing I hear is that bellowing breath. And yeah, it was a real gift at the same time, though. Part of me was just scared shitless. But it was at the same time what I needed to kind of just really push me through. It was a really physically uncomfortable session. I took every last single keisaku that was offered. I received it. And so much so that the person that I was rooming with noted when I changed my shirt that I had some bruising on my back. But yeah, it was ultimately a really wonderful experience. And I did feel a calling to come here. But finding out that, at least at that time, that it wasn't quite yet time. There was a point where I thought I wanted to come to the fall Kese in 2009, and didn't end up doing that. I went through this like immense clarity of yes, and then immense clarity of no, yes, no. And I was like, oh, I'm feeling a little, kind of schizophrenic here, like what's really going on? And I was like, oh, okay, now when they come together and I can see them as a whole, it's yes, I want to do this, but not at this time. And ended up not doing Kese then, returning later, and in the meantime having time when I was able to be with family. My aunt, shortly thereafter, when I determined I wasn't going to be coming, was diagnosed with cancer. And I ended up spending time with her and my uncle. Less than a year later, she ended up dying from the colon cancer. So it was really a gift to be there with her and him at that time. And really ended up being something that I became very, very close to him. My aunt was really wonderful, though. I know that he absolutely, he loved her to no end. And actually, in thinking of like the time when she actually passed, there was a number of us that were present there. And it came to the point, it was evident, she was going to pass. The moment was upon us. And so my uncle said, like, I love you, Linda. And she just, all of a sudden, she comes to and says, I love you too. And that was her last breath, was saying, I love you too. Yeah, so I spent time with him, and otherwise ultimately came back to Syracuse. I became a resident at Hoenji. Certainly had times. Anytime I would go to Minnesota where my aunt and uncle lived, I actually, of all things, I essentially had my own room in their house. It just sort of worked out that way at some point, and it was kind of, they just ultimately referred to it as my room. And ended up being that space where I always stay when I go be with my uncle all those years afterwards as well. He ultimately died while I was here. And I do really miss him as well. And there was just something of being through that process of grieving together. And we'd certainly talk about it, but just being present with one another. It was really definitely what was the most influential in sharing that bond, and something that's I'm really grateful. It was my uncle. In some ways he was a friend and a mentor, and somebody that I would, I'd talk to with some frequency. So really grateful to have had that time as well. So ultimately, as I was saying, doing Keses and such, and I did that in fall of 2011, both of them in 2012. And in that process, having this sense of wanting to be ordained, even in my childhood, I can have memories of wanting to become a priest. And I don't really know when, I don't know the context. All I know is that I never witnessed the context. I'd never encountered some other priests or father or ordained nun as well in any tradition that really seemed I connect with. I didn't have a connection with any of the ones that I encountered. And I think it was less to do with them, and just more to do with the fact of there was something else that I just wasn't finding. And as I indicated, ultimately found in going to Hoenji. But so much in my life, there's this element of not yet, not yet, not yet. I don't know what your experience is of that, but there's things that I have a sense of that they're true, and yet I'm just not quite in the position where I'm ready and life is ready with providing the opportunity. So I ended up in a long-term relationship, which was really a blessing as well. it had its challenges, as all relationships do, but it was ultimately something in which like we acknowledge each other of being growing partners and best friends. Somebody I actually haven't talked to her in like 5 years, and in part my time here has been kind of revolving around like understanding in part that relationship, but mostly my conditions that were limiting to the relationship. And yeah, there's been a lot of unfolding in this process. Like that relationship ended in fall of 2016. I came for Kese. And at that point was pretty broken and downtrodden. That's where there's a line that, for whatever reason, it stuck out in my mind for years, perhaps as I mentioned my deep investigation of samsara, but from the Diamond Sutra of, furthermore, if virtuous men and women who receive this teaching are downtrodden, their unfortunate destiny is the inevitable result of karma committed in their past mortal lives. By virtue of their present misfortunes, the effects of their past will be worked out, and then they will be in a position to realize supreme enlightenment. So at that time, it was really, I feel there's something in that was like, it became clear to me of like, even all those years of being together, I wasn't willing to give up some sense of being able to come back here to ordain. And ultimately requested Roshi to ordain me as a monk, which then occurred in March of 2017. But another thing that I wanted to acknowledge in that fall in particular was my gratitude to Chigan Roshi. I know that I've shared this with some other folks since the time, but in that fall there was the Golden Wind session. You gave a talk, and you spoke of your own experience at some point of being in the Zendo and having tears want to come forth and suppressing them, and acknowledging that by virtue of not allowing them to come forth when they were ready, that you had to pay for that over the course of years until you were able to come to the point that in that practice, through that time, that you could ultimately let them go. And in knowing my circumstances, ended up talking to me directly and encouraging me after session of like, if tears come, just let them fall. And it was a real gift. I had lots more tears that needed to fall. I was fortunately with decreasing amount, but I think literally every day for the next 7 weeks, I cried every day. And there would be times of like, all I would do is basically like be in Samu and then just have to stop and cry and then go back to work. And maybe it'd be that morning, maybe some other time, but just like kind of that cycle. And it was definitely really a purifying thing though. I think some of it, as I noted, like all the ways in which in my life I had essentially been suppressing my own experience, my own emotions, like dulling it, essentially not wanting to be open to my own views of myself also cut me off from my own experience. And in that process was really able to have the ability to really just be with that. And it's been an ongoing gift. It's something that I've certainly learned in others, but that was the most direct, immediate experience through my own emotions, to really just be able to be present with them and just allow them to be, to come and to go. And also to Jinpo Roshi, I want to acknowledge in the Mondo process. So it's really a process of what they term emotional koans. It's a great companion to our practice in that it at least gives some, well, I guess a method towards really being able to engage with things. There can be elements in which, we talk about dwelling in the inner void and stuff, where there's a disconnect between our insight experience and enacting, living in our lives. And he could see where I was at that point, and had me on what they termed the hot seat, which isn't, it's just more of his sense of humor, quite honestly, but an element where you engage indirectly. It's really a group experience, but there's people that he brings up and like really has a direct experience with them, like, engages with them. And it was really a fortunate thing. I think it was at the point that I really started to have a much, much better sense of like what I learned later of like what underlied so much of my self-destruction was basically shame. As I mentioned, all these things that I regretted. Well, for a long time, I think it was far worse than just regret. I mean, there were basically points of condemnation. I have can be very, very, very critical, particularly of myself. Perhaps others have experienced some of my criticism as well, but it's something that through the process I've really been able to start to lessen that grasp, to be able to see the fact of, like, as I said earlier, like, okay, things happen, but they're not defining. They're things that, I can learn from, that by virtue of their present misfortunes, the effects of their past will be worked out. So there were things that I needed to confront, things that I needed to go through, even if I didn't feel that I wanted to, or they were somehow a reflection of me as a human being. And then I guess really in part now coming back to my grandmother, because of the fact that, like, throughout my time here in particular, the greatest lesson I received from her was radical acceptance. And I can't even really quite explain it. Like, there's a way in which, like, I didn't know I received it, and I've been increasingly aware of just the profound power of it. It just doesn't seem to have any sense of limitation, time, distance, whatever. Like, they're all irrelevant. It is completely unbounded. It was just from the depth of her heart. And I really do feel that it's one of the purest expressions of love. To know that there's nothing that we have to do but simply hold the space where somebody can just be wherever they are, whatever they're going through, to accept and embrace it. And then I think that's really the only place where we can really genuinely respond. I mean, if we go in with the notions of, like, oh, if only you did this, only you did that, oh, like, maybe if I did this, it would help. And there was never any of that. It should be helpful just simply by being present. And I'm eternally grateful for that. Eternally. So, I kind of wish I could be a little bit more succinct, but so coming back to, like, being here in the long-term training, I came here, was ordained March 2017, formally left residence after Obon this year, but found myself back here. There were still some things in going out in the world that needed to really start to, in some ways, not just clarify, but accept what had been clarified. And it was definitely a very interesting and challenging process. I think part of it is, like, having done kesses before, there's ways in which you do kesse that there's certain things that you don't necessarily have to confront. Over a shorter time period, it's kind of easier to let go of various things and just dedicate yourself to what you're doing at that time. But at least for myself, I found over the longer period, there's just this convergence. So many parts of my life just came together. They seemingly disparate part of my lives, different stages, like living in different places, like different groups of friends and all sorts of things. And those ways in which all the things that I had not quite tended to, they indeed, as they had previously, reared their head. And having come here at a time where, in that fall beforehand, of, real sense of loss of a significant relationship, found the interesting ways in which there were so many other things that came forth. As I mentioned before about, like, Mondo Zen and shame. I think it must have been that fall they had their first Mondo session. And I was paired with one of the former residents, Reifu, and Jinpo Roshi's sister, goes by Katma, basically an abbreviation of her first name in Madhyana. It was really one of the most wonderful things of that time to be paired with these two people. And that's where I was mentioning things about shame. And, if you think back to earlier when I started this about my parents, I always knew I was loved. But through the process of delving into these things, came to the realization of knowing that I was loved, but feeling wholly unworthy of it. And there was an immense freedom in just being able to acknowledge that. There was one of the priests in the Halobon Sangha. I can picture him. I unfortunately can't think of his name, but He talked about this and the fact of like, by revealing it, you disempower it. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Mind you, at the same time, in disempowering it, there was also ways in which I had to confront a lot of things that were built around it and within it. And essentially went in what I'll term like kind of great hell. Yeah, I learned a lot through that whole process though. There was points where my first thought of the day, I've heard that theoretically this is not possible. There's a realization after you wake up. But my first thought in the day was literally, fuck. Like just the element of having to like deal with another day in which I felt horrible. But yeah, saw through that process. It didn't last forever. And at the same time, there was just a way in which like, no matter the difficulty, to just step forward. But I also finding the ways in which like, more and more science acknowledges like how things are embodied. It's literally in our bodies. And that was some of the challenges that I really found in looking back on like my youth and like depression. There's ways at some point in which like, I don't know if in some ways it was because of things that preceded it or just the simple fact of like my genetic karma would have it that at some point like physiologically like I would have certain chemicals expressed in my brain, and for that it would basically result in things like depression, anxiety. And through the time in being here, really delved into that. And at this point, like have a very different relationship to it. Yeah, I mean, I found there's things that you'll hear about, particularly in yoga, but like things that just seem to have been released. Where yeah, I just have times where I just basically feel like really sick and nauseous and stuff. And you wonder if you're getting ill or what it is, but really in knowing the context of things and like reflecting on it, finding it was like, basically, yeah, things releasing, like emotional, whatever you want to call them, trauma or otherwise, things in the body that I hadn't been able to like really deal with or been let go of. And it's been an immense process of just really kind of releasing these hindrances and like purifying. And one of the things that, one of my dear Dharma brothers, Weekend, has practiced here for some years now. Actually, he came in just before I returned in March of 2017 and started residence. But one of the things that he said to me was that, no matter what, that I would just keep showing up. Maybe I was in the best mood. I can be a little moody. But I just kept doing it and giving my all and giving my all and giving my all. And even for him, saying that was something that he needed to see. That had been a lesson for him. But at the same time of like, not knowing that, just each day you get up and, some of you just kind of push through, but sometimes it's just the element of like, yeah, you're pushing, but at the same time you're pulling. You're really allowing yourself to like say, okay, like we just have to get through this, just, get to the next step. And sometimes it is that. You're just getting out of bed, like kind of that feeling would pass at times. Just the mere act of just saying, okay, this is how I feel at the moment. And yeah, so I guess really what I want to acknowledge kind of to close out here is like we'll call it the post-1,000 days. And so there was immense power in having that time period. But then really being able to have the period thereafter in which you've completed your training. But then there's just, I don't know what to say, except the fact that like really feeling that my practice came to life over the course of that period following, and especially over the course of this year. So many ways in which, I found it challenge like being here during the pandemic, particularly in the early times. We didn't have a teacher coming. There weren't events, there wasn't other Sangha members. It was just residents that were able to be here through that difficult process of even getting people through the door. Figuring out, okay, we don't know what to do, but we know this about, the pandemic and like what ways we can at least offer a safe environment to practice. And, it still had its challenges. One being in a position where, by virtue and part of my time here and having been put already in the Shika role prior to that as well, kind of had to do my best to step up. and not necessarily feeling adequate to the task, and would say falling short certainly at various points, knowing that my own difficulties and being able to like face the situation and be able to really be of support of others also, created its own challenges for myself and others. And yet somehow in the whole process, like something just sort of changed at some point. And I found even in like the time of coming back here, where, just realizing a tenderness for myself. I mean, this is something I don't even necessarily remember the last time in my life where I felt a genuine tenderness towards myself, for myself, within myself. In part seeing that, like, by virtue of having all those challenges, times where I didn't know what to do, that the effects that it was having on other people, and having in this ways in which engaging with the residents, that, to see that mirrored back to me, to know at times just those subtle ways in which, like, okay, something you say, you do, or just your energy. There's just something embodied in that way that as little, causes them their own challenge. It's been definitely that real gift, as I mentioned before, of the Sangha, that mirroring. And then other things of like, as I said before, of like having to come back now, because there's things that it's like, all right, I can see them, I just don't like what I see. And having to come back in part to be like, okay, I actually do see it, I don't like it, and I'm trying to create an alternative. And that's only causing trouble for myself and other people. And seeing that's not really in my intention. And to see that I can't find some sort of assurance in other people. That's one of the things of having so long of just viewing myself so negatively. To like feel better, you have to like seek it from other people. Well, they can't really offer it either. They can offer support, they can offer their open hearts, like all the warmth and like love that you can imagine. At the same time, it's never going to be enough. And to really see that I can find it within myself. It's something that's still available. I wasn't able to access it for so long, but now I actually feel this opportunity to really step forth, to look upon whatever lies ahead, to actually feel encouraged by, challenges, to find the ways in which those challenges, I learned so much about myself and about other people, to really learn what real faith is, real faith, and a way in which it's really not in any particular thing. It manifests. And I had found in talking to Roshi, it's I could only describe it as it's not something you have in anything or of anything, and yet it holds everything. So in closing, I'd just like to acknowledge in part, I just found myself reflecting on one of the people that I've really grown to love here over the years is Geno, and she's given Dharma talks over the years. And one of the things she talked about was that whole process of having to learn how to allow herself to experience all of life. You're getting kind of caught in these things in which you really only feel a sense of negativity, and you repeat this process over and over and over. But to get to the point where you can allow yourself to have other options, that you can be vulnerable, it can open up to the possibilities to experience other things with people and view yourself in other ways. And I really appreciated that from her. And then in that process, really talking about after all those years of practice, after all those years of struggle first, that the second half of her life has been just so much better. And in some ways, that's kind of it. I don't know how long I'll be alive. And yet at the same time, regardless of time, I just feel like a new beginning, new possibilities in what can be ahead. I don't have to script it. I have things, of course, that call to me, things that I'd like to still experience in this life. At the same time, to be really open and aware of what is presenting itself at this time. Being open to that, seeing where it leads, and having a real sense of just possibility. The unbounded possibility of life. And that's been really the thing of ultimately of taking away from my time here, of this way in which really confronting myself and ultimately sharing with all of you has been completely life transformative. I really would not be here without this practice. As I said, like, I was pretty self-destructive. I wasn't intentionally trying to kill myself, but ultimately I'm amazed that I didn't die. And to be in an environment in which, to have this wonderful chance simply to live this life together, to have this practice together, and simply to share it in all its pain and all of its joys has been truly, truly, truly a gift. So I thank you.